You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
We're standing in Herbrand Street in the borough of Camden, an unassuming side street near to Russell Square Underground Station. Back in the 19th century, this street was also known as Little Coram Street, and was one of London's poorest localities, home to, and I quote, some of the most degraded of the London poor. Little Coram Street stood within the parish of St George's in Bloomsbury, a grand church which you will find a few streets away just beyond the British Museum. The buildings which stood on Little Coram Street were home to around 1,700 people, many of whom were displaced from the infamous slum of St Giles's in the Field, known as the Rookery, when parts of it were demolished. These slum areas were noted in police records at the time for their appalling levels of juvenile crime and immorality, referred to as labyrinths of hovels of crime. The curate of St George's Church at the time was a Reverend Samuel Haddon Parks. Haddon Parks was much concerned with improving the lives of the poor within his parish, and was particularly concerned with the living environments of his parishioners. He referred to the overcrowded homes in his neighbourhood as guilt gardens, where impurity, crime and disease grew in abundance. In 1860, Haddon Parks decided to run an experiment to tackle these problems. What he came up with was a flower show. His flower show would be held exclusively for the impoverished residents of Little Coram Street. The rules were that plants had to be in possession for at least 4 weeks before the show, with inspectors sent round participants' homes in order to guard against deception and protect the honest exhibitors. Fuchsias and geraniums were purchased cheaply by competitors and placed in flower pots or teapots, water jugs and washing basins, cared for on windowsills and doorsteps up and down this street until the day of the show. Monetary prizes were given for the best blooms, and the show was declared a success and repeated annually. In 1863, the third flower show was held in Russell Square and featured 547 plants, observed by over 3,000 visitors to the show. After the first show, it was asserted that flowers growing on the windowsills of the poor were one of the safest indications of a well-ordered and civilised home. The very presence of flowers in the home became a sort of moral index. Those with the greatest fondness for cultivating flowers were seen to be the most skillful and industrious workmen, and importantly were seen to express, and I quote, a determination not to be absorbed into the surrounding hard world, but to have a heart still to feel, to long, to worship, to strive upwards. Flowers were thought to soften and humanise the minds of the poor, reminding their cultivators of God's creation and instilling good habits of foresight and prudence in the care demanded. Aside from these moral and spiritual benefits of floriculture, however, flowers were also positioned as preachers of public health and social economy. In the close, smoggy streets of 19th century London, plants would not flourish without sufficient fresh air and ventilation. At this time, when miasmas of vitiated air were still blamed by some for the prevalence of disease in crowded urban areas, the benefits of fresh air were much celebrated in public health efforts. Plants were thought to clean the air of a room by their production of oxygen, and in so doing balancing the atmosphere, and this myth has only just been scientifically debunked. Flowers were also thought to cultivate certain good habits in their gardeners. If the leaves of your plant were drooping, you might open a window to let in fresh air, or open the curtains to let in the sunlight. You might even rise early before the chimney smoke rose and the smog settled, in order to give your plant a little bit of fresh air on your doorstep. One writer even goes so far as to recommend that plants should be taken on trips to the countryside to take the air. These actions were considered to be beneficial not only to the health of the plant, but also to the health of the human inhabitants in the room. Haddon Parks and other middle-class moral reformers at the time made frequent connections between humans and plants, asserting that plants are very much like human beings. In order to grow strong, healthy and vigorous, they must have as much sunshine and fresh air as is possible, otherwise they grow stunted and sickly. Haddon Parks remarked in 1865 that cleanliness, as with men and women, so with plants, is absolutely essential to health. It was recommended that houseplants should be given frequent sponge baths, much like children, to get rid of the dirt and dust which settled on their leaves. Plants then became indicators of unhealthy environments. The moral reformer Elizabeth Twining wrote in 1863 that a room in which dirty scraps are allowed to remain is not wholesome for either children or plants. Both will fade and lose their freshness, although we may see it more easily in plants than we do in the children. Twining was confident in the ability of flowers and plants to teach people good habits, so much so that she suggested that the mother of little children will never be in doubt how to treat her plants, for they want exactly the same kind of treatment as her children do. That is, frequent cleaning, feeding, exposure to sunlight and fresh air. The working-class flower shows, first established by Hatton Parks in 1860 in this street, inspired many similar events across the country, organised by churches, missionaries and ragged schools, all hoping to cultivate a love of flowers amongst the working poor so that the plants might teach their lessons of cleanliness and morality. As remarked by Hatton Parks in his reflections on his first experiment, our teaching is too often unheeded, but where we fail, plants will succeed.